One of the most common questions I hear as a lawyer is it too late? Or did I wait too long? Those questions come after months, sometimes years of waiting to get legal advice, waiting to deal with the issue of property, waiting to address the issue of child support, spousal support, waiting for the right time. And by then, time has already changed the possible outcome and some of the options you have or would have had previously. Welcome to Family and Beyond. I'm Delalu. I'm a family lawyer legal coach, and I'm your host. Today, we are starting a 3-part series called The Cost of Waiting. This is part 1, and we're talking about family law. And I want to be clear what the series is, essentially, and what is not. This is not about blame. It's not about regret. It's about understanding why people wait. I see it every day. The overwhelm is real. The fear is real. The hope that something will resolve itself is real, and it's human. But understanding why people wait doesn't change what the cost of waiting is. And that is what this series is about. Today, we are going to walk through 3 specific scenarios where delay has real measurable consequences. Let's talk about property. When you acquire property in the middle of a separation that has not been legally resolved, meaning there's no court order, there is no agreement, things can get quite convoluted. Imagine you've been separated for 3 years. You finally buy a house, you save some down payment during that period, you're excited to move forward. Then you discover that the property you co-own with your ex has not really been resolved, meaning that suddenly what felt like a fresh start now becomes another legal issue you have to deal with. Spousal support is another issue. In spousal support, we're talking about entitlement. We're talking about what that looks like after a period of time when nothing is discussed, one person moves on, goes to school, becomes more self-sufficient. What does that look like in the grand scheme of things after time has passed? What does it look like when someone doesn't apply for child support when they should apply for child support? What happens after years of not asking? What happens after years of not making voluntary payments? What does it mean legally when a parent notices changes in a child after separation and does nothing, waits, and hopes that these symptoms or these changes disappear on their own? These are the conversations we're having regularly with people. Who didn't know what they didn't know? And if any of this sounds familiar, I want you to stay with me through this episode because clarity is always the first step towards something better. Now, here in Alberta, when 2 people separate, the law that governs how their property is divided is the Family Property Act. So whether you're married or whether you're in a common law relationship. And under this act, property acquired during the relationship is generally subject to equal division. So both sides have an interest. If it's a marriage, there's a life interest in the property, regardless of whose name is on it. And this is the part people don't understand. That separation, even though it's happened, it's still a process. It's not a moment of was separated, so things are resolved. It is a process. People don't finalize their legal matters overnight. And while that process is ongoing, sometimes, it takes months, sometimes it takes years. Life continues. And somewhere in between that space, in between that process, people tend to move on to other things. One spouse acquires something new, a new property, an investment, a business interest with other people. And they assume that because they have emotionally moved on or even moved on physically to a different space, that things have somehow resolved itself or that the acquisition belongs to them alone because, we're separated and I just got a new car. That is not always how the law sees it. If the property matter has not been formally resolved through a signed agreement, a court order, a judgment, there can be arguments that the new asset acquired falls within the property pool that needs to be divided. And this is the part that shocks people. So For one party, what felt like a fresh start then becomes a subject of a new dispute. I've sat across from people who purchased properties after they're separated. The divorce is not finalized. There is no agreement. They took on mortgages, made significant financial commitments, even involving other people, whether through a business. And then doing this sort of, I just want to move forward. I just don't want to wait. But because they didn't understand that the legal separation and the physical separation are different things, they make decisions that have long-term effect that are quite costly. The legal separation is only complete when there has been a signed agreement, period. Until then, the line remains open. Everything can still be for the taking. Even though it's not clear, there can still be some gray in there, but there is always an argument to be made when things are not fully resolved. Let me tell you one thing I hear more than I share, especially when it comes to the issue of support. Let's say, I don't know why this person, they make voluntary payments. I mean, they know they have kids. And I did ask one time and they did not respond. So I went on about my business. And, 3 years, 4 years passed. I didn't ask for child support. And by the way, I have these kids in all of these activities. They're in swimming, they're in piano, they're in jiu-jitsu, they're in gymnastics, and, they're doing school tournaments and all of that, hockey. And you're incurring all of this cost. There's no discussion, there's no request, there's no confirmation. And you come 3 years, 4 years later to say, well, I've done the math and I've spent 40,000 in extracurricular activities. I've spent this amount on this. And so he owes me or she owes me this amount of money. The court want to know why you waited to request. They want to see evidence that you requested. They want to know if there was a discussion about these extracurricular activities before the costs were incurred. And if not, why? Because again, we see situations often whereby one person makes all of these decisions, doesn't discuss it. The other person doesn't have the financial capacity to cover this cost, but they incur it anyway. And then they come years later and they're like, well, I think you should be paying a portion of it. Yeah, the law says things differently. So do not wait. This is also similar for spousal support. I hear this all the time where one person says, I didn't even know to ask. I wasn't sure I was entitled to anything. And I just wanted this to be over. I just wanted to move on with my life. And then, spousal support is one of the most misunderstood areas of family law, I find, because people assume it's only for certain relationships or certain marriages without really knowing the intricacies that go with spousal support, whether the entitlement, what the court is looking at, the factors, one person's ability to pay, the disparity, the economic disadvantage from the breakdown. What role did each person play during the relationship? Was one person moving from country to country so the other person could advance in their career? Did one person stay at home based on the agreement of the parties in order to raise the little children? And has there been a significant change in the standard of living as a result of the breakdown? So there's so many factors that the court will consider, but sometimes people wait. So you have a scenario whereby parties separate. One person who was a stay-at-home mom, for example, goes on to go to school. She gets a degree. She never requested for spousal support because she didn't want to deal with it. It was such a high conflict situation. She didn't really want to speak with this person. All that said just made things difficult. So she goes on to school. She gets a degree. She gets a job. Now she's earning comfortably. She's become somewhat self-sufficient. And then someone tells her, you're entitled to spousal support. And then because of that weight, things have changed in terms of what self-sufficiency may have looked like at the time of separation when she was in school or not even commenced school to now when she's working. There may still be some entitlement for sure, maybe being compensated for the years lost. But in terms of having to compare incomes, things will look different at that point. So again, this is one of the scenarios whereby waiting can be costly, right? So if someone has been financially independent for a period of time Post-separation, argument might then change from having rights on the compensatory and non-compensatory to just compensatory. So again, you need to speak to a lawyer because this varies case by case. So it's always important to seek legal advice for clarity. One other thing we talk about that we see often is the children having to experience separation with the parents can carry enormous amount of guilt, emotion, distress, anxiety, amongst other things. There is grief on the parts of the parents, the logistics of two households, the financial pressure, the legal uncertainty, the exhausting work of co-parenting with someone they are in conflict with. And in the middle of all of that, the kids are watching, they're distressed sometimes. You notice maybe a child has stopped sleeping, they're withdrawn from school, they're quite angry all the time, they're anxious, they're oddly quiet. They stop doing the things that they love to do. And the parents see it, and then they mean to do something, but they're so overwhelmed with their own grief, with their own issues, that they just push things to later. Courts in Alberta would only make decisions that are in the children's best interest. That assessment includes how each parent has responded to the child's needs, whether appropriate support was sought, whether the child's distress, especially when visible, was addressed. Listen, seeking support isn't a sign that you have failed as a parent. It's often one of the clearest signs that you've recognized your child needs help. It is evidence that you noticed and that you responded, that your child's well-being is priority. But waiting, even when that wait comes from overwhelm, not indifference, it can look like inaction from the outside. And in family law, in family courts, inaction has consequences. So if you've noticed changes in your child and you haven't taken the steps, that is something to do now, not later. Let's bring all of this together. Everything we've talked about today comes back to three themes we're talking about in this season 2. Clarity, choices, consequences. Clarity is seeing the legal issue before it becomes a big problem. Choices is understanding the options you still have, not just the ones left after waiting. And consequences is recognizing that time changes more than dates on a calendar. It changes evidence, finances, and in most cases changes the options and the possible outcomes. Honestly, I understand why people wait. It is not usually carelessness and it's not usually indifference. Sometimes it's overwhelm. It is the weight of trying to hold everything together when everything feels like it is coming apart at once. I get it. But the law is not waiting, and we can't change yesterday, but we can make better decisions today. And sometimes that's all the law requires us to do. Know this. Time doesn't make legal problems disappear. It often makes them more expensive. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Family and Beyond, episode 3, talking about the cost of waiting. Stay tuned to part 2 and part 3. It promises to be very interesting. On to the next episode.